Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm finally ready to bring you my Say Cheese and Die franchise ranking. Now, this has been a long time coming. I started reviewing these books, I think last year, or maybe 2 years ago almost. I forget. But I've been jonesing to get through this little mini franchise of Goosebumps, and now that I recently finished the last one I needed to get to, I figured I'd go ahead and drop this while I can. And who knows, there might be some more Say Cheese and Die content to come out in the future, like a Goosebumps graphics adaptation, or maybe another episode in a different season of a Goosebumps show. Who knows? But as of now, we only have 6 things associated with it, so I'm comfortable making the video now and then possibly having to remake it later. I'm willing to take the risk. So, the question you probably all have to me is, Completionist, what's your thoughts on the Say Cheese and Die franchise? I think it's a miracle it exists. If you ask me, Say Cheese and Die should have just been a one and done book in the original 62. It never needed a sequel. It could have had its iconic Ryan Gosling episode adaptation in the 90s show and been just fine. But no, we had to keep going with Say Cheese and Die again, and we got that episode, and then we got, later when Horrorland brought back Goosebumps from the dead, another Say Cheese and Die installment, making this a true franchise. And then we have the 2023 episode adaptation, which isn't close to the books whatsoever, like the running gag of the 2023 show seems to be. But nonetheless, we have Say Cheese and Die content, and to me, over time, it just kind of opens my eyes to the reason probably why I only ever loved the first book. When I was a kid, I loved it. It was one of my favorite Goosebumps books. And over time, my love kind of waned on it, but it maintained being a childhood favorite. As an adult, I no longer love it the same way as I did as a kid. I don't think I actually love the book anymore. But there is one particular thing that we'll go over that I do still love, that I have loved since I first saw it. And we'll get to that in the ranking. But at least I have that to kind of latch onto. Everything else, to me, is give or take. There's only one other thing I think you really must experience for being a Say Cheese and Die fan. If you happen to be one out there and you love that original 62 book, you probably already know about Say Cheese and Die again, but yeah, we'll get into it. And it's not that. To me, this franchise isn't the worst in Goosebumps, but it's all over the place. It's very mixed for me, and I have a lot to say, so we might as well get into it. So yeah, let's start off with number 6. Now, I should preface this. 5 out of the 6 here are going to be graded with a kid's horror curve, because one particular installment is in a property with the Goosebumps name, but it's not geared towards kids. And I'm talking about the 2023 iteration of the Goosebumps show. That, to me, is more geared towards young adult and adult sensibility. So I'm using that criteria and grading rubric on that specific episode. So if you're wondering why I'm being so harsh on my number 6, which happens to be Say Cheese and Die's 2023 episode, it's because I don't have kitty gloves on for this. It's getting treated like adult media. Now, why is Say Cheese and Die's episode from 2023 the absolute worst in the franchise, in my opinion? It's because 3 main reasons. 1, I hate this episode. I hate the writing of it. I hate how it establishes the story for that season 1 of the 2023 show, how it introduces the characters, all of the filler content in the first half of the episode before we even get to the main character of the story for this episode, who is Isaiah, who ends up stealing the camera from the house and all of that. If you've seen the episode, you know what I'm talking about. I hate it all. But I will say the stuff we get with the camera, albeit very little stuff we get, was pretty good. But there's just not a lot of it, and it only comes into play in like the final 15 minutes of the episode. And it's woulda, coulda, shoulda. Yeah, I hate this. I hate this with a burning passion. I wish that the writing could have been better, that they would have had better insight in how to handle doing standalone stories in a long-form anthological season show. But I can tell you, their original intention with season 1 was to have all this stuff carry over, and it was probably going to bring back the camera in season 2 in some capacity to tie up loose ends and stuff like that. They weren't thinking they were going to go anthology with season 2 with The Vanishing. I promise you that. So with this original intention, it just shows that this was a big mistake, in my opinion. I really don't want to lay into it too deep, but I'm just going to cut it off here. I'd probably give this episode maybe like a 1 out of 5 stars. It's terrible, in my opinion. And the only reason why I'm giving it a 1, and since I don't curve adult media, I don't have to give it a 1. I can give it a 0, is for the good stuff with the camera in the final 15 minutes. I think that was genuinely good stuff. Other than that, thumbs down. Now, some of you might be shocked that this wasn't my number 6, but at number 5, we have another terrible, terrible entry of this franchise. And I'm holding up this specific DVD case for a representation of this episode. And we have Say Cheese and Die Again's episode here. I gave this a 1.5 out of 5 stars with the kids' horror curve. This episode is a train wreck. From a production standpoint, from an acting standpoint, from an adaptation standpoint even. All of the good stuff that could have been salvaged from Say Cheese and Dies Again, the book, was completely cut out of this episode adaptation in favor of streamlining it. There's some budgetary changes here that I think kind of work better. Like keeping the same camera from the first episode was a good idea. I do like there is the subtle change of going back to Spidey's lair and finding, finding a man kind of waiting down there was really creepy. Maybe not as good as the nail scene from the book, but I think that was pretty tense for what it was. And having, the Spidey Say Cheese chant throughout the episode does help. But yeah, this episode, despite all of that, you have a lot of the sins from the book here. Mr. Sauer's awful. You don't really feel the impact of Greg's bullying that's going on in the book from his peers. And I think the book kind of highlights his emotions and how he's being treated a whole lot better than the episode does. In the episode, it just comes across kind of corny and cliche in that 90s way about making fun of people who are overweight or what have you. As the main character, Greg, turns in the story, and I'll show you on the back here, you can see a kid wearing a fat suit. Yeah, the subject matter is still very questionable, and it sends pretty bad messages involving that. And it's kind of showing kids bad examples of how to treat kids who are different, I guess. But for the most part, like I said, it just feels like the book in its weaker areas, and it doesn't improve it whatsoever. This should have been a complete rewrite. I have no idea why they just straight up adapted this one. But I do know the backstory. The showrunners did not want to make this episode. They absolutely didn't, but they were pretty much forced into making it. And you can clearly tell, and that's why it's one of the worst episodes of the whole show, in my opinion. Yeah, this thing sucks. So that's why it's number 5. Now at number 4, a slight step up. I don't think this book is terrible like everybody else in the community seems to think it is. I think there's a lot of strengths to it that people don't give enough credit to, but that's going without saying. It still is a bad book, but it's not the worst thing ever. And it's Say Cheese and Die Again from the original 62. Now I'm going to be upfront. I didn't hate this book as a kid, and I still don't necessarily hate it now. I just think it's just a poor follow-up, and on the fundamental basis of this being a sequel to Say Cheese and Die, this commits one of the biggest cardinal sins ever in Goosebumps with these sequel books. And what I'm getting at with that is you give the main characters who are returning in the starring role in the follow-up plot amnesia, and you make them stupid and make them completely forget the lessons they learned from the first one. So when they come into the sequel, you have to dumb down the scenario. You have to make it really unbelievable and stupid for the audience just to root against the characters for being as dumb as they are. And then you have to suffer through that. That's what this book does off the cuff. But then you get thrown into some stuff, like I've already mentioned with the episode, about the weird subject matter going on here. And the whole book, when you look at it, it's kind of making a joke on the idea that the camera adds 10 pounds. And I think R.L. Stine has gone on record as saying that's the idea that he thought of when he came up with Say Cheese and Die Again. And while I don't think that's necessarily a bad idea, you have completely different camera mechanics working here that weren't a thing with the same exact identical camera from the first book. So without going into too much detail on that, a lot of this stuff just feels random for the sake of it. The whole plot setup about Greg wanting to get an A on a paper and prove that his story is true is really dumb when you think about it, because why would you share a story that you know? And Greg even admits this in his monologue that people probably won't believe it. But why would you even do that in the first place? It just shows that you lack awareness, and that whole setup is really stupid. And getting down to the horror of the story, a lot of this book is just Greg getting bigger over time and being bullied about it. And it's just hard to stomach. But the one thing gripping about it is some good scenes, like the nail scene. That's pretty bloody and intense. And I will say, Greg's monologue in this does help ease the pain for this story, which is very, very middle of the road to begin with. But his honesty and how he feels is kind of an inflection on perhaps how you can feel in the situation. And I think it is relatable and cathartic, because I grew up being a bigger kid, and I was definitely bullied over my weight at some point in my life. Whether when I was bigger or when I shrunk down into a toothpick because of medication I was taking, right? And I can be upfront and honest about that with you all, but I think it's really relatable what Greg goes through in this story and how he displays that to the reader. Other than that, it's a very weak story. The climax kind of feels all over the place, and the whole concept about the negatives and the positive stuff is a cool twist, but none of this stuff was in the first book, and then again, it just adds to the plot amnesia going on. I will say this, in retrospect, to give a compliment to the episode, I think the ending is better in the episode version compared to this book version here, because it's much more satisfying for what happens to a certain character. But other than that, that's really all I have to say about this. It's a bad book. I think it's mildly overhated, but not the worst thing ever in this franchise. All right, now moving on to my top three. Now we got out of the rut here. At number 3, we're going to be looking at the main story. I'm not talking about the secondary story in the back of this book. I'm just talking about the first 80 to 100 pages that you get in these. This is from Arc 1 Horrorland, and we have Say Cheese and Die Screaming. Now, I know this is a fan favorite modern Goosebumps book, and I can say this up front. If you have never read the original Say Cheese and Die, and you go into this one first, I can totally see why you would love this one over that one. Because in this book, I think this is by far has some of the most grisly images ever in the Say Cheese and Die franchise. The main character, who's Julie in this, and it isn't the main character that we got to see in Say Cheese and Die, the original book, and Say Cheese and Die Again, who was Greg Banks. I think Julie was a pretty fair protagonist. You know, you have the storyline of her trying to best her rival, who's also a photographer for a school assignment. And she comes across this camera with her friend at this garage sale that perhaps is cursed. It might be linked to a horror movie that never got made because, according to urban legend, it set a curse onto the film. And since this camera is one of a kind, not a lot of people know about it or how to defeat its magic. And Julie spends majority of the book dealing with what this camera does to people. And she watches her friend have this horrific eye injury happen because of the camera. There's a horrific basketball injury that happens to a basketball player she takes a picture of. There's these two mean girls who have their skin contorted into, non-human skin. Even her own little brother has his head turned into something very grisly. And it feels strangely out of Why I'm Afraid of Bees. I'll just put it there. The camera here has more of a threat level than the previous camera. And this is not linked to Say Cheese and Die whatsoever, in my opinion. I don't think this has any ties to Spidey. I don't think this has any ties to that original camera. Some people have said that this is a prequel book. It's not. It's not a prequel. It's not a prequel. It's its own separate entity of a story, just using a cursed camera. And I think for the most part, the story is fine. Just that's kind of its weakness to me. It's just fine, though. I mean, minus the spectacle moments being as good as they are. To be fair, the story is very rushed through. This is like an 86-page story. There's a lot of context being, mulled over. There's not a lot of satisfying answers involving the camera's origins and all of that, which the book, to give it credit, tries to touch on it briefly, but then again, it's just not enough there for me. And the climax, which is a Chekhov's gun in the story, and as you'll see in the book, you'll know what I'm talking about with a certain swimming pool. It's very lackluster. And the twist ending is very lame too. And, kind of padding on top of that, my dislike for the Arc 1 Horrorland setup to begin with, I thought that this was pretty good despite me not liking how the book was, plot structured and paced. I'd probably give this one maybe like a 3.9 out of 5 stars. Maybe on a better day, if I read more Horrorland, I might be able to bump this up to a B tier at some point. But as of now, I'm willing to put it here. So now we're in my top 2. And of course, we just have the original Say Cheese and Die left to talk about. We have Say Cheese and Die, the original 62 book, and Say Cheese and Die's episode. Now, if you listened to me in the beginning of the video, my number 2, sadly, is going to go to the Say Cheese and Die book. And there's a reason why I have it this high, and I also have it below my number 1. I think that this book is a great classic original 62 book for what it is. I think Greg, while he's not the best protagonist ever, the story does kind of, honestly lay his character out. I can't remember if this is a third-person book. I think it is. And despite it having that nature to it, there's a lot of character dialogue and characterizing going on with the periphery cast in the story, which is not something you see every day in Goosebumps. And I will say the whole, the backdrop of the story with involving the kids going into a house which is believed to be haunted by this homeless guy named Spidey, who is very creepy and might be, doing something weird up in there, is really cool. And they end up finding this cursed camera inside of it and taking it out of the house. And, Greg becomes the owner indirectly and starts to, take pictures and, pretty much curse anybody that he pictures. And this version of Say Cheese and Die, unlike the Say Cheese and Die Screaming book, which pretty much affected whoever got their picture taken instantaneously, this camera predicts bad futures. And I think Say Cheese and Die again kind of played on the same idea, but it did it a little bit differently there as well. But the rudimentary sense is if Greg takes a picture of his family's car, it's going to turn out to be a bad picture of them getting into a car accident, right? And that's something that happens in the story. And Greg has to realize that he's holding pretty much a loaded gun in his hand, right? And the power of that is, and you can see this metaphor in the story, is that the more he carries around this gun, the more the temptation rises to not want to use it, but also use it in defense, right? And we see him accidentally use it a couple times, and it ends up backfiring and hurts his friend at a baseball game where he gets horrifically injured there. And there's something that happens to his friend which causes her to completely vanish and go missing. You can see that symmetry there of him holding a loaded gun with the camera and realizing the gravity of his mistake. And while he's trying to do the right thing, he also has to kind of cover up his own behind because the police are kind of looking into these events happening, and Greg seems to be the prime suspect. And obviously nobody's going to believe him about the camera. So what he has to do is figure out a way to solve it all. And he comes up with the conclusion with the photos being taken. And now I should mention this. The Say Cheese and Die camera is one of those Polaroid dispensing cameras. When you take a picture, it instantly pops out, and you have a physical copy on hand already, and you don't have to go to like a Kodak developer or Walgreens or whatever to get your photos developed. You already have it on hand. He comes up with a way to solve the situation, and it builds up to a pretty tense climax where something ballsy happens to a certain character, and we get an exposition drop about the camera's origins. And while it's kind of loose in logic, and that's one of the biggest negatives about it, for the book wholesale, at least we have answers. and I think the twist is pretty iconic in its own right, even though I don't think it's like the best thing ever, right? But you might be wondering, why is this my number 2 if I have so many compliments to it? I think the book just spends a lot of time in dialogue with characters and not enough time in the spectacle moments. It does kind of drag in some areas involving that aspect. And to be honest, some of the answers we get at the end, I think, needed a little more page room to kind of flesh out. And I wish this book had a real prologue, maybe going into the backstory of Spidey, or maybe the characters leading up to the event of going to Spidey's house, and then building more onto, the Herb X side that this book had in the early portions of it. I think that could have really helped this book pop. But for what it is, it's a solid B tier experience for Goosebumps. I'll probably give this like a 4.1 out of 5 stars, which is a B minus, but it's still an exceptional grade for a Goosebumps book, in my opinion. But it's not as good as my number 1. And my number 1, I think, is pretty much my absolute favorite thing to come out of this franchise. And it goes to the Say Cheese and Die episode. I mean, this stars Ryan Gosling. It's an iconic episode from the 90s show. And it has so many great moments that I think just do it better than the book in some aspects. Even though I think the book had way scarier scenes involving the camera than the episode was able to do. I just think that wholesale in terms of story, condensing it all, adding more Spidey into the mix, cleaning up some of the answers we get by the end in some contextual ways, really does improve the story, and for it having a better twist than the book, in my opinion, it also sends it off in a better note. Now, with that being said, for this being a 22-minute condensed version of this book, it does keep a lot of the sins of the book. It does keep a lot of the sins, and I guess I'll bring them up here now. The first sin that it still keeps is that it doesn't really evolve the concept from the book. You keep the car accident scene, you keep his best friend's disappearance in the story, but you don't really improve on that, right? Given the budget constraints, given the time. They cut out the tenser parts of the camera in the book, like the whole baseball scene, I guess for budget, or maybe the showrunners were too afraid to do that one. But that's kind of there. In terms of kind of answering what the camera is, the book was a little more vague, because it's just a camera that predicts bad futures, but it also makes people disappear and all this stuff. And the episode still keeps that stuff, even though we get a clear answer by the end of what it's exactly doing, which makes it even more confusing, especially given the whole character that disappears and all of that. But I digress. Like I said, it keeps the sins of the book. And yeah, those things do add up here. And like the pointless dream sequence, I didn't even bring that up in the book. That's literally was inserted into the story to begin with to match the iconic Tim Jacobus cover that was on the original 62 book. It's still in here. But other than that, I think this is a solid step up, because you're condensing the filler out of the book, and I think that's pretty much the main thing that sells me on this. And also, I think the camera looks cooler. I think Greg is played up a little cooler here, even though you don't get much of the deeper stuff that you get in the book. It's a good trade-off here. Like I said, the best trade-off is having more Spidey in the mix. I'd probably give this like a 4.4 out of 5 stars, which is a B+. And this, without a doubt, is the highest rated thing I have for this franchise. So that's why it's my number 1. So all said and done, Goosebumps, the Say Cheese and Die franchise, does it get the Goosebumps completionist seal of approval? Kind of. my top three, Say Cheese and Die Screaming, the original Say Cheese and Die book, and the Say Cheese and Die episode with Ryan Gosling, are the three worth checking out in this franchise. Everything else you can completely avoid with a 10-foot pole. I'm looking at Say Cheese and Die Again's book, the episode, and the 2023 episode. You do not need to experience those. As a matter of fact, if there was an alternate reality that completely deleted the 2023 show and Say Cheese and Die Again, and all we ever got was Say Cheese and Die and Say Cheese and Die Screaming, I think that would be a much better reality to live in. But like I said, you might like or even love the first book, and if you fall in love with Greg Banks, maybe it might be worth it to you to check out Say Cheese and Die Again. Even though you never see his character again, it might be worth it to you there. Say Cheese and Die Screaming, it has a completely different camera, a completely different setup. It's darker, and it's arguably more scarier at times. Maybe not as goodly as written as the original book, but that's a cool new take on Say Cheese and Die Screaming if you want to try that out. In the 2023 show, honestly, you can skip the Say Cheese and Die episode all the way up until the final 15 minutes, and you'll be just fine there. Other than that, yeah, this franchise is a mixed bag. I kind of half would recommend it to you, half wouldn't. And that's kind of sad, but I feel like there's going to be franchises that we have yet to talk about that I'll probably feel a similar way towards, but we'll get into that when we get to it. So, yeah, that's my thoughts on the Say Cheese and Die franchise. Let me know down in the comment section, how would you rank this franchise? What's your least favorite all the way up to your favorite? And, yeah, I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.